Based on a few issues that have come up since the last packet of amendments you adopted earlier this year, we're before you with a proposal, just three specific proposals, and I'll briefly describe those. The first proposes to revise Table 2.1, the table of permissible uses, solely with regard to the business commercial zoning district. The members of the council who have been here for a while will recall that a couple of years ago we talked about the idea, really the problem of our existing industrial zoning classifications, whereby they have become increasingly used for non-traditional industrial uses. So we came up with the idea of gradually phasing out that the existing I-1 zoning district and replacing it with two districts, one the business commercial district and the other the industrial district, whereby the business commercial district would reflect uses such as you see on Brooks and Commerce Drive, which is a mix of light industrial uses, but also offices and service type uses, which our I-1 has frankly increasingly become. And then the industrial would be reserved for sites that are more truly industrial. Industrial Park Drive comes to mind as a likely place for that particular classification. Depending on how we see the future of Mistletoe Hall Farm, that might be specified as industrial. So we went ahead and created that zoning, or those two zoning districts in the text of the ordinance, but we didn't yet change the map. So this was not an issue really until Talbot Commerce Park came into town earlier this year. And for a number of reasons, it was determined that the most appropriate zoning for that site was business commercial. So partly, maybe largely in response to that annexation and the existing uses that are out there, we've taken a closer look at the business commercial zoning district, and we're proposing a few changes to that zoning classification. I think I counted 11 such changes in all, and they range from changing uses that are now permitted to not permitted and vice versa, and some that require special exception to be outright permitted. So that's the first change. I will say that I believe, I'm fairly confident that Mr. Showalter is here to request sort of a twist on this. And this was discussed with the Planning Commission, but just theoretically, Mr. Showalter now has an actual application of what we discussed, and that is, if we make these changes, obviously it's anticipated that the currently I-1 zoned land, at least much of it, will eventually become BC. So when that happens, these changes would apply to them, but in the interim, it would only apply essentially to Talbot Commerce Park, because that's the only area that's zoned BC. So for some period of time, hopefully just a matter of a few months, but we don't really have a way of knowing, the existing I-1 zone land would not be able to take advantage of the changes we're proposing unless we made them simultaneously to the I-1 zoning district. When we discussed it in theory with the Planning Commission, they said, well, without something at the table, let's just worry about that when we do the comprehensive update. Everything will get rezoned, it'll be taken care of. Of course, since we didn't do that, Mr. Showalter now has an actual application of that. And I'll let him speak to that after I describe the other two uses, our proposed changes. One is simply to clarify there is a conflict in the zoning ordinance with regard to setbacks for swimming pools. It only comes into play in limited circumstances because the supplemental standard for swimming pools prescribes a setback of 8 feet, which is generally also the setback, certainly in the residential zoning districts, which is where you'll find swimming pools, obviously. But in a couple of PUDs, they were established through the site plan and PUD approval process at less than 8 feet. For example, Cook's Hope has 5-foot side setbacks. So there is confusion at best, conflict at worst between those two standards. And so this is merely an attempt, and as I discussed it with the Planning Commission, I told them I frankly do not care which way you go. It just needs to be clear in the ordinance. So if they thought the 8 foot was appropriate, I proposed one way to change it. If they thought 5 foot in that situation was appropriate, there was another way to change it. So what you see is the language that proposes to add language to the supplemental standard, which would read, the swimming pools must be set back a minimum of 8 feet from any property line. And then the added language would be, or may adhere to the minimum setback of the district, whichever is lesser. So in the case of Cooksug, for example, this would allow swimming pools to be built within 5 feet, the same as principal structures on those lots. And then finally, the third proposed change deals with a use that we've seen come up a few times recently, which is really a twist on agricultural uses. And I have, for lack of a better term, I have called it agriculture, controlled environment. And it refers to, one of the changes is to propose a definition which reads the practice of agriculture either wholly or partially within a structure in which such factors as temperature, light, and humidity can be regulated. It's a trend. I don't know that it is changing agriculture necessarily, but it's certainly a trend, and I think it is, in terms of use, is probably more industrial in character than agriculture typically is, given that most of, if not all, of the activity occurs under roof. I think this could, this would probably replace the closest definition to the medical marijuana, as opposed to the agriculture, which I previously found it would be covered under. And that's not to say that we wouldn't. In fact, I think we should even more specifically address that particular use. But for the time being, this would cover that. It would cover such things as a couple of years ago when we had a grower of organic lettuce that wanted to locate in our community and take up something like 90 acres of essentially greenhouses, all under greenhouse roof. So that proposes, that definition that I just read, it proposes to add this use to the table of permissible uses as outright permitted in the A1 or agricultural district and all of our industrial districts. And as possible through the special exception use in the government institutional and the non-downtown commercial zoning districts, of the CG or CL zoning districts, and then prohibited in the remaining residential zoning districts. And then it proposes 3 supplemental standards, which read, A, in addition to common agricultural activities, agriculture controlled environment may also include elements of manufacturing, processing, packaging, storage, distribution, etc. The second is that retail sales shall be permitted provided they are of a scale that is clearly secondary and incidental to the primary agricultural based use of the property. And C, that the applicant shall demonstrate and maintain compliance with any state and/or federal standards or rules regulating the particular good or product being grown or processed on site. So those are the 3. There is also a request pending before the Planning Commission that they didn't feel like they had enough time to review and include in this. So depending on how they come down on that, and that was the issue that Mr. Silverstein referred to them with the clothing and other goods donation boxes that you see popping up around town. The Planning Commission just briefly discussed that issue and talked about licensing options as well as zoning options, and I'm confident they will be before you. Probably they meet again next Thursday, so probably not your next meeting, but the following meeting with some sort of proposal which may or may not include zoning amendments, depending on which way they come down on that issue. So, if you have questions of me, I'd be glad to answer them. If not, I know at least one member of the general public is dying to say something.
This being a public hearing, we invite public comment.
I don't know that I'm dying. Eager. So I'm here tonight on behalf of 806 Frederick Road LLC, which is the contract purchaser of Lot 18 on Commerce Drive. It's the vacant parcel located on the east side of Commerce Drive, immediately north of Chick-fil-A. It's a triangular-shaped parcel that has the pond on it. And that property is being purchased for the purpose of developing a full-service car wash. The center, as you can see behind Ms. Cook's shoulder, is purple. It's zoned, bless you. It's zoned I-1. And based on the uses that are there, as well as the uses on Brooks Drive, it's very likely to be rezoned to BC in the future. And that may be, as Lynn said, a couple of months, it may be longer. But we have an application that we are ready to move forward with as soon as this text amendment is complete and effective. So I would request that you amend the table of uses to also include car washes as a permitted use in the I-1 district, which will allow us to get going 2 to 6 months earlier without having to wait for that rezoning.
I didn't describe which uses were proposed to be changed, but that is one of the, currently car washes are prohibited everywhere except the general commercial, I believe.
That's correct.
And this would permit them outright in the BC zoning district as well.
And Lynn, you had mentioned prior to the start of the meeting that given the schedule of the Planning Commission that we could get them to weigh in on this particular item since...
If you felt that was helpful or necessary, as I indicated, they meet a week from this Thursday, which would be a couple of days before your next meeting, so we certainly could get a recommendation relative to that particular request, now that there's an actual real-life example that we're going to deal with.
Because we will be leaving the record open at least till the end of this week, and then any comments from the Planning Commission would be welcome in our deliberation.
Be happy to appear before them. And the only other thing that I will speak about is the pool setbacks. Lynn and I were involved in the ambiguity at Cooksoe, and that is one example. I don't know off the top of my head the Easton Village setbacks, but a PUD is established to provide flexibility, to encourage creativity and design, and the village at Cooksoe has a very compact development pattern, and it, I think, is appropriate to permit swimming pools to have the same setbacks as principal structures, detached garages, or anything else out there. So it was unusual to see the town encourage a compact development plan, allow reduced setbacks, and then have the pool have a greater setback than a 2.5-story house. So I would encourage you to adopt the language recommended by the Planning Commission.